You think you can drag my name through the mud, and I'll just sit here smiling, you smug little weasel? Clint Eastwood's voice cut through the air like a blade, his eyes narrowing at Jimmy Kimmel across the talk show desk. The audience gasped, their murmurs rippling through the studio as the tension crackled. Clint leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Jimmy, usually quick with a quip, froze, his smirk faltering under the weight of Clint's glare. This wasn't the scripted, banter Jimmy had planned for his late-night show. This was personal, raw, and ready to explode. The trouble started years ago when Jimmy, chasing ratings, aired a segment mocking Clint's decades-long career. He'd called Clint's films dusty old westerns and joked that his directing was stiffer than the horses he rode. The audience had laughed then, but Clint, watching from his ranch, felt the sting of betrayal. He'd met Jimmy early in the comedian's career, even given him advice over drinks one night, back when Jimmy was just a radio guy clawing for fame. Clint had seen potential in him, believed in him. To hear Jimmy reduce his life's work to a punchline hurt worse than any critic's review. He'd sworn he'd never do Jimmy's show, but tonight, against his better judgment, he'd agreed to promote his latest film. The moment he sat down, he sensed Jimmy's smugness, the same old hunger for cheap laughs. Jimmy tried to recover, flashing a nervous grin. "Come on, Clint, we're just having fun here. You're a legend, everybody knows that." His voice dripped, with false charm, but his eyes darted to the producer's booth, signaling for a commercial break. Clint wasn't having it. He slammed a fist on the desk, making the coffee mugs jump. "Fun? You call making a fool of me fun? You got no respect. Kimmel? None. You think you can tear down what I built and I'll just nod along?" The audience was silent now, hanging on every word, sensing this was no act. Jimmy's face reddened, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being challenged, not on his own turf. "You're taking this too personal, old man," Jimmy snapped, dropping the friendly host act. "This is show business, not your personal diary. You can't handle a joke. Maybe you shouldn't be here." The words were sharp, meant to sting, and they did. Clint's eyes blazed, his voice low and dangerous. "I've faced tougher men than you, kid, and I'm still standing. You want to talk tough? Let's talk about how you've been riding my coattails for years, using my name for your little gags." The crowd gasped again, some cheering Clint's defiance, others stunned by the raw hostility. Jimmy leaned back, trying to regain control, but his voice betrayed his nerves. "You're out of line, Eastwood. This is my show, and I say what goes." He pointed a finger, his tone sharp and condescending. "You don't like it? There's the door." Clint stood slowly, towering over the desk, his presence filling the room. "You don't get to dismiss me, Kimmel. Not after what you did. You want to talk about your show? Let's talk about the truth for once." The audience held its breath, sensing a storm was about to break. Clint wasn't just here to promote a movie. He was here to settle a score. "You think you can drag my name through the mud and I'll just sit here smiling, you smug little weasel?" Clint Eastwood's voice sliced through the studio like a whip, his steely eyes locked on Jimmy Kimmel across the polished talk show desk. The audience gasped, a wave of whispers rippling through the crowd as the air grew thick with tension. Clint leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the armrests of his chair, knuckles white, his face a storm of barely contained rage. Jimmy, usually quick with a snarky comeback, froze, his trademark smirk crumbling under Clint's piercing glare. This wasn't the light-hearted banter Jimmy had scripted for his late-night show. This was a raw, personal grudge, ready to erupt. The bad blood started years ago, a wound that had festered in Clint's mind. Back when Jimmy was a struggling radio host, Clint had met him at a Hollywood bar, shared a whiskey, and offered advice on navigating the cutthroat world of show business. Clint saw a spark in the young comedian, believed he had grit. But years later, chasing ratings, Jimmy betrayed that trust. On his show, he aired a segment mocking Clint's career, calling his westerns dusty relics and his directing stiffer than a saloon door. The audience had roared with laughter, but Clint, watching from his quiet ranch, felt the sting of betrayal. His life's work, his stories of grit and honor, reduced to cheap punchlines. He'd vowed never to sit on Jimmy's couch, but tonight, against his gut, he'd agreed to promote his new film, a gritty drama about loyalty. From the moment he walked onto the set, he sensed Jimmy's smugness, that same hunger for laughs, at any cost. Jimmy tried to regain his footing, flashing a nervous grin. "Come on, Clint, we're just having fun here. You're a legend, everybody knows that." His voice oozed false charm, but his eyes flicked to the producer's booth, signaling for a commercial break. Clint wasn't letting him off that easy. He slammed a fist on the desk, the thud echoing as coffee mugs rattled. "Fun? You call making a fool of me fun? You got no respect, Kimmel. None. You think you can tear down what I built and I'll just nod along like some spineless hack?" The audience fell silent, hanging on every word, their excitement palpable. Some shifted in their seats, sensing this was no rehearsed bit. This was real, raw, and dangerous. Jimmy's face flushed, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being challenged, not in his own kingdom. "You're taking this too personal, old man," he snapped, dropping the friendly host act. "This is show business, not your personal diary. Can't handle a joke? Maybe you don't belong here." The words were sharp, meant to cut deep, and they did. Clint's eyes blazed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "I've faced tougher men than you, kid, and I'm still standing. You've been riding my coattails for years, using my name for your pathetic gags. You think you're clever? You're nothing without people like me to mock." The crowd erupted, some cheering Clint's defiance, others stunned by the venom in his words. A few clapped, their applause fueling the tension. Jimmy leaned back, trying to reclaim control, but his voice cracked with nerves. "You're out of line, Eastwood. This is my show, and I say what goes." He jabbed a finger at Clint, his tone dripping with condescension. "Don't like it? There's the door. Don't let it hit you on the way out." The audience gasped again, a mix of shock and thrill. Clint stood slowly, his tall frame towering over the desk, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. "You don't get to dismiss me, Kimmel," he said, his voice steady but laced with fury. "Not after what you did. You want to talk about your show? Let's talk about the truth for once. Let's talk about how you stabbed me in the back for a few laughs." The crowd held its breath, some leaning forward, others whispering to their neighbors. A woman in the front row clutched her purse, eyes wide, as if waiting for a fistfight. Clint wasn't just here to plug a movie. He was here to settle a score, and everyone knew it. Jimmy's eyes narrowed, his composure slipping further. "Truth? You want truth? The truth is, your time's up, Clint. People tune in for laughs, not your old grudges." He leaned forward, voice rising. "You're a guest here, so sit down and play nice, or I'll have security drag you out." The threat hung heavy, the audience buzzing with anticipation. Clint didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the desk, his shadow falling over Jimmy. "You don't scare me, Kimmel. You're a coward who hides behind jokes. You want to talk about dragging? Let's see who gets dragged when I'm done." The studio felt like a powder keg, ready to blow. Every eye was on Clint, waiting for his next move. Clint Eastwood stood like a monolith, his shadow looming over Jimmy Kimmel's desk, his words still echoing in the hushed studio. "You want to talk about dragging? Let's see who gets dragged when I'm done." The audience was a coiled spring, their murmurs rising and falling, some cheering Clint's defiance, others frozen in shock. Jimmy's threat to call security hung in the air, but Clint's unyielding stare made it clear he wasn't backing down. The host's smug facade cracked further, his hands twitching as he gripped the edge of his desk, searching for a way to flip the script. "You're making a fool of yourself, Eastwood," Jimmy spat, his voice sharp with venom. He leaned forward, trying to reclaim the spotlight. "You think you can come on my show and throw a tantrum? Nobody cares about your hurt feelings. This is entertainment, not a therapy session." The crowd stirred, a few booing Jimmy's harsh tone, but he ignored them, his eyes locked on Clint. "You're a relic, man. People want fresh, not some dusty cowboy whining about respect." The insult was a low blow, meant to humiliate, and it landed hard. A woman in the audience gasped audibly, her hand covering her mouth, while a man nearby shouted, "Shame on you, Kimmel!" Clint's jaw clenched, his voice a low rumble. "A relic? I built this industry with my bare hands while you were still begging for scraps. You don't get to lecture me about entertainment, you two-bit hack." He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the stage, each step a challenge. "You mocked my work, my life, for a quick laugh. You think that makes you a king? You're just a vulture, picking at better men's bones." The audience roared, some clapping wildly, their support for Clint swelling. A grizzled man in the back stood, pumping his fist, his face lit with admiration for the icon standing up to the slick host. Jimmy's face twisted, his composure unraveling. He wasn't used to losing control, not here, where he held court every night. "You're delusional, Clint," he sneered, standing now to match Clint's height, though he looked small in comparison. "You think these people care about your old movies? They're here for me, for my show. You're just a guest, and you're wearing out your welcome." He gestured to the crowd, expecting their loyalty, but the response was mixed. Some clapped, weakly, but many sat silent, their eyes on Clint, waiting for his rebuttal. "You're wrong, Kimmel," Clint said, his voice steady but laced with contempt. "These folks know hard work, loyalty, the kind of values you spit on for ratings. You betrayed me, used my name to climb your greasy ladder, and now you're too spineless to own it." He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping over them, connecting with their nods and murmurs. "You all know what it's like to be stabbed in the back, don't you? To have someone you trusted turn on you for a quick buck?" The crowd erupted again, louder this time, their cheers a wave of support. A woman in the third row wiped a tear, her face full of pride for Clint's stand. Jimmy's eyes darted, his confidence shaken by the crowd's shift. He tried to laugh it off, but it came out forced, hollow. "Oh, please, spare us the sob story. You're not some victim, Eastwood. You're just mad you can't take a joke." He turned to the audience, arms spread, playing for their sympathy. "Come on, folks, you want fun, right? Not this guy's whining." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Boos rained down, sharp and unforgiving, as Jimmy's smirk faded. He glanced at the producer's booth again, his hand signaling frantically, but no one moved to cut to commercial. The show was spiraling, and he was losing his grip. Clint seized the moment, his voice rising with conviction. "You don't get it, do you? You think this is about a joke? It's about honor, something you wouldn't know if it bit you. I came here to talk about my work, my story, and you tried to turn it into your circus. Not tonight, Kimmel." He pointed, a finger, his voice a growl. "You want to throw me out? Try it. But you'll have to face every person here who's sick of your cheap shots." The audience roared louder, some standing now, their applause thunderous. Jimmy's face paled, his hands shaking as he realized he'd underestimated Clint. And the crowd. The studio vibrated with the audience's thunderous applause, their cheers for Clint Eastwood drowning out Jimmy Kimmel's weak attempts to regain control. Clint stood tall, his finger still pointed at the host, his words, "You'll have to face every person here who's sick of your cheap shots," ringing like a verdict. Jimmy's face was a mask of barely concealed panic, his hands trembling as he gripped the desk. The crowd's boos stung him, their loyalty slipping away like sand through his fingers. He wasn't just losing this fight. He was losing his stage, his kingdom, and he knew it. "You think you've got them all wrapped around your finger, huh? Jimmy snarled, his voice shrill with desperation. He stepped around the desk, closing the gap between him and Clint, trying to reclaim some dominance. These people don't care about your honor nonsense. They're here for a show, and I give it to them every night. He jabbed a finger toward the crowd, but his bravado faltered as more boos erupted, sharp and relentless. A man in a flannel shirt stood, shouting, "You're the one who's done, Kimmel!" The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a wall of defiance. Clint didn't budge, his eyes locked on Jimmy like a predator sizing up prey. "You're wrong again, Kimmel," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "These folks see through you. They know a snake when they see one. You built your career on tearing others down, and I'm here to call it what it is: cowardice." The audience cheered louder, some stomping their feet, the sound shaking the studio floor. A woman near the stage waved her hand, yelling, "Tell him, Clint!" Her voice carried the weight of years spent admiring a man who stood for something real. Jimmy's eyes flashed with rage, his control slipping further. "Cowardice? You're calling me a coward?" He laughed, a bitter, mocking sound, but it didn't land. "You're the one living in the past, Eastwood. Nobody cares about your old-school values. This is my world now, and you're just a guest who's overstayed." He turned to the side, snapping his fingers toward the wings. "Security! Get this guy out of here!" The crowd gasped, their cheers turning to shouts of protest. A young man in the back yelled, "Let him speak!" as others joined in, their voices a rising tide. Clint raised a hand, silencing the crowd with a single gesture. "You don't need your goons, Kimmel," he said, his tone icy. "I'm not done yet. You want to talk about the past? Let's talk about how you begged me for advice, how you sat there soaking up every word I gave you, then turned around and mocked me for laughs. That's not show business, that's betrayal." The audience leaned forward, hanging on his words, their faces a mix of anger and awe. A gray-haired man nodded slowly, his eyes misting as he remembered Clint's films, stories that had shaped his own sense of right and wrong. Jimmy's face twisted, his desperation boiling over. "You're pathetic, Clint, digging up old grudges, like some bitter has-been. You think you're a hero? You're just embarrassing yourself." He stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "Get off my stage before I make you." The threat was a mistake, and he knew it the moment it left. His mouth. The crowd's boos swelled, deafening now as they rose to their feet, chanting, "Clint! Clint!" A woman in a red sweater clapped furiously, her face alight with defiance, as if she, too, was fighting Jimmy's arrogance. Clint didn't flinch, his voice steady as steel. "You don't make me do anything, Kimmel. You're not the boss of me, and you're sure as hell not the boss of them." He gestured to the audience, their chants growing louder, a wave of support that shook Jimmy to his core. "You've spent years hiding behind your desk, throwing stones at better men. Tonight, you answer for it." The crowd's roar was deafening, their energy a living thing, fueling Clint's resolve. Jimmy stood frozen, his eyes darting between Clint and the audience, realizing he was cornered. The show was no longer his. Jimmy Kimmel stood frozen, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's, as the audience's chants of "Clint! Clint!" reverberated through the studio. The air was electric, charged with the crowd's defiance and Clint Eastwood's unyielding presence. Jimmy's hands clenched into fists, his face a mix of rage and fear, as he realized the show, his show, was no longer his to command. Clint, towering and resolute, stared him down, his voice still ringing with the challenge. "Tonight, you answer for it." The audience was on its feet, their cheers a tidal wave, some clapping so hard their hands reddened, others shouting words of support for the man who'd become their champion. "You think you can turn my own crowd against me?" Jimmy hissed, his voice cracking with fury. He stepped closer to Clint, his chest puffed out in a futile attempt to match the icon's stature. "This is my stage, Eastwood, my rules. You're nothing but a washed-up cowboy throwing a fit." The insult was desperate, a last-ditch effort to claw back control, but it fell flat. The audience booed louder, their voices a wall of rejection. A burly man in the front row shouted, "You're the washout, Kimmel," as others nodded, their faces set with disgust at Jimmy's arrogance. Clint's eyes narrowed, a faint smirk playing on his lips, but it was cold, dangerous. "Your stage? You're a tenant here, Kimmel, and your lease is up. These people see you for what you are, a cheap shot who can't stand on his own." He turned slightly, addressing the crowd directly, his voice steady and commanding. "You, folks know what it means to work hard, to build something real. This guy?" He jerked a thumb at Jimmy. "He's made a career out of tearing that down. He betrayed me, used my name for laughs, and he's done it to others too. Ain't that right?" The crowd roared in agreement, their voices shaking the rafters. A woman with gray curls stood, clapping fiercely, her eyes shining with admiration for Clint's grit. Jimmy's face turned crimson, his desperation spilling over. "You're full of it, Clint," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "You think you're some saint? You're just a bitter old man who can't handle the world moving on." He waved a hand toward the wings, his voice rising to a near scream. "Security! I said get him out!" Two burly guards appeared at the stage's edge, hesitant, their eyes flicking between Jimmy's frantic gestures and the crowd's hostile glares. The audience erupted in protest, chanting, "Let him stay!" A man in a denim jacket stood, pointing at the guards. "Don't you dare touch him!" he yelled, his voice raw with loyalty to Clint. Clint raised a hand again, calm but firm, silencing the crowd once more. "I don't need your goons to shut me up, Kimmel," he said, his tone like a blade. "You want to talk about moving on? I've been making stories that matter while you've been peddling garbage. You mocked my work, my life, and you thought I'd let it slide? You thought wrong." The audience cheered again, their support a living force, fueling Clint's resolve. A young couple in the middle row clasped hands, their faces alight with pride as if Clint's stand was theirs too. Jimmy staggered back, his bravado crumbling. "You're ruining my show," he spat, his voice trembling with rage and fear. "You think you can just walk in here and take over? I made this place what it is." But the crowd wasn't listening. Their boos drowned him out, their chants, for Clint growing louder, more unified. A woman in a floral dress stood shouting, "You made nothing, Kimmel! Clint's the real deal." Jimmy's eyes widened, his hands shaking as he realized he'd lost them completely. He looked to the producer's booth, but the crew stood frozen, unsure how to salvage the chaos. Clint stepped forward, closing the gap between them, his voice low and fierce. "You didn't make this, Kimmel. You rode on the backs of people like me, people with something real to say. Tonight, you're gonna learn what happens when you cross a man who don't bend." The crowd's roar was deafening, their energy a wildfire, and Jimmy's face paled as he saw the truth. He was alone, exposed, and outmatched. The studio pulsed with the audience's unrelenting chants of, "Clint! Clint!" Their voices a roaring tide that left Jimmy Kimmel stranded, his face pale and his hands trembling. Clint Eastwood stood unwavering, his final words, "You're gonna learn what happens when you cross a man who don't bend," hanging like a guillotine over the host. The crowd was a force of its own, their cheers and stomps shaking the stage, their loyalty cemented to the man who'd called out Jimmy's betrayal. The two security guards at the stage's edge hesitated, their faces uncertain, caught between Jimmy's orders and the crowd's fury. "You're finished, Eastwood!" Jimmy shouted, his voice a desperate rasp, but it was swallowed by the audience's boos. He stumbled back toward his desk, his eyes wild, grasping for any shred of control. "You can't do this to me! This is my show, my life!" He slammed his hands on the desk, his voice cracking. "You think you're better than me? You're nothing without this stage, and I'm the one who runs it." The crowd's boos grew deafening, a chorus of rejection. A man in a worn leather jacket stood shouting, "You run nothing, Kimmel! Clint's worth 10 of you!" The audience roared in agreement, their faces alight with righteous anger. Clint stepped closer, his presence towering, his voice calm but laced with steel. "You don't run a damn thing, Kimmel. You've been coasting on other people's work, my work, for years. You mocked my life, my stories, and thought you'd get away with it. Not anymore." He turned to the audience, his eyes sweeping over their cheering faces. "These folks know what's real. They know a man who stands for something, not a clown who tears it down for laughs." The crowd erupted, their applause a thunderclap. A woman in a blue scarf stood, clapping with tears in her eyes, her voice joining the chant. "Clint! Clint!" Jimmy's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling under the weight of the crowd's rejection. "You're all brainwashed," he spat, pointing at the audience, but his voice was weak, pitiful. "You think he's some hero? He's just an old man with a grudge." The crowd's boos drowned him out, relentless, as a young woman in the front row shouted, "You're the one with no shame, Kimmel." Jimmy flinched, his eyes darting to the security guards, but they hadn't moved, their faces uneasy as the audience's chants grew louder. Even the crew in the booth stood still, unwilling to intervene in the face of Clint's command. Clint leaned in, his voice low, cutting through the noise. "You had your chance to own up, Kimmel. You could have shown some guts, admitted you were wrong. But you're too weak for that. So here's the truth. You're done hiding behind your jokes." He straightened, addressing the crowd once more. "This man used my name, my work, to build his little empire. But tonight, you all showed him what happens when you cross the line. You showed him what honor looks like." The audience roared, their cheers a tidal wave, some standing on their chairs, others waving their hands in support. A gray-haired man in the back shouted, "You tell him, Clint," his voice thick with pride. Jimmy sank into his chair, his face ashen, his hands shaking as he realized the depth of his defeat. The crowd's chants filled the studio, a celebration of Clint's triumph. The security guards stepped back, their heads bowed, unwilling to challenge the man who'd won the room. Clint turned to the audience, his voice steady, resolute. "I came here to talk about my work, my story. But I stayed to remind you all, don't let anyone tear down what you've built. Not a man like this." He pointed at Jimmy, who looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The crowd's cheers swelled, a final thunderous ovation. Clint walked off the stage, his head high, the audience's applause following him like a victory march. Jimmy sat alone, the desk his only shield, as the crowd continued chanting Clint's name. The show was over, but the lesson lingered. A man of honor doesn't bend, and a coward's reign doesn't last.